Hey everyone, in today's video we are going through the differences between the digital version of Gloomhaven and the physical version, because there are some changes both to the campaign mode and to the general gameplay mechanics sometimes at play here, which I know that a lot of people will be interested to hear about. I have researched this list along with the developers of the game, Flaming Fowl, so thank you to all of the guys who looked in and advised on this video a little bit, trying to pull some strings together to make sure that I have a really accurate list for you guys that gives you a lot of information here. And this might not include every single change, every small tiny little change, but I've tried to include everything here that is worth speaking about that I think has a real kind of ramification to the gameplay that I think tabletop players might want to think about. You know the drill. If you do like this video, please do like and subscribe. Come follow me over at Twitch at twitch.tv/mandatoryquest, where I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Sunday. I'm going to be streaming a lot this week too for the full launch of the campaign, so hopefully I will check you guys out over there during the week. So changes to the campaign and some general changes for stuff outside of scenarios and dungeons. Perks and prosperity naming changes. Checkmarks are now called perk points, with 3 perk points unlocking a full perk. The total prosperity level is now called the wealth level, and prosperity points are now used to increase the wealth level. This is just a naming change to make things a bit clearer in digital. The prosperity, scaling, and perks are all still unchanged. For reputation, at time of recording, there is no way to see the reputation tracker, which is what physical players would manage themselves, having to mark up and down as the players gain and lose reputation. The most important thing to remember with this is the -10 and the +10, which gets you either Eclipse or Sun. Max positive or negative also will add special events to the city and road decks. For events and encounters, both city and road, in digital you do not get to see if your party characters might have affected the outcome of an event. In physical, you would have the symbol and a different resolution, but this is all hidden in digital. This is a minor change, but if you are making decisions based on your party, you don't always get that immediate feedback that what you chose actually was affected by which character you are. You also don't get any feedback when new events are added to either deck through retirement or through other events that might come up. It's funny how the manual act of actually doing things makes you much more aware of them, right? It's just a subtle change, but it's worth noting. The player lineage system has been changed, so when retiring characters in tabletop, you as a player would get an additional perk for each previous character you'd retired. This has now been worked into a generation system, with each new generation getting extra bonus perks. So all starting characters are generation 0, and then once one of these characters retires, the new character becomes generation 1, getting an extra perk. All future characters that are created, regardless of who creates them after that point, will be generation 1 and receive the same bonus perks. This will happen until a generation 1 character retires, which will then create a generation 2 character, and so on, with each generation getting an additional perk. This adds a bit of a rubber banding mechanic in a way, because players who maybe retire less characters can still get the same extra perks as those that retire lots, getting everybody around the same power level with perks. Enhancements no longer persist onto future characters of the same class. However, you do now have the option to refund enhancements at the cost that you paid. This gives you a lot more flexibility to maybe try things out or add an enhancement for a particular scenario to a particular card. It's definitely a lot more forgiving than the permanent nature of having to do those stickers in the board game. The removal of persisting enhancements was discussed with Isaac Childress, the designer of Gloomhaven, and he agreed it, and that it was not really an intended mechanic, it was more just a limitation of the fact that they were using stickers and the stickers had to live on the cards. Now, the developers have added this refunding mechanism to the game, which I think is just a nice safety valve for players who possibly invest quite a lot of money, because these enhancements can be a lot of money, potentially invest them into a card and then they make a mistake and then it's permanent and you can't undo that. So I think it's just a nice thing here to stop players from maybe making a mistake. All personal quests can be seen more than once, but only if all of the other quests are already out. It's much more likely that players would consider maybe making multiple characters in digital, because it's very simple to do, rather than maybe being in physical, you having to manage several characters at once. It's very simple in a digital environment to have multiple characters. If a character class has already been unlocked, then the matching personal quest, just like the board game, will actually just unlock a random item design and a random side scenario instead. There is no Envelope X, so any scenario, any personal quest, or any event that would be linked to Envelope X has now been reworked to include different rewards. So the missions are still there, However, they have been reworked. Envelope X was always meant as an additional Easter egg for physical players, and it would have been very hard to actually make it work in digital just by the nature of the puzzle and what it asks you to do. I often get asked on the channel, will I ever consider covering Envelope X? And I think it's just a mystery that's best left to be discovered by players themselves. If you really want to find out about this, there are plenty of threads on BoardGameGeek to find out. And if you are playing in digital and you don't think you'll ever play in physical, just Google it and you can find out all of the answers and the puzzle essentially. There's a few changes to some items. The most important one though is being the stamina potion nerf to 1 less card each. So the minor only gives 1, the major gives 2. This is generally accepted nerf, that since the printing people have said that these potions are too powerful. So it's a generally accepted nerf, and I believe it is the accepted FAQ nerf, so makes sense that it's been done here. Available quantities of potions in the shop have actually been scaled to suit the party size now too. So this means that you don't have to fight over the potions as much. You will be able to get a potion for each mercenary. The leather armor item has been reworked and buffed slightly. It's actually slightly better in this version. Chimeric Formula, the Tinkerer level 9 card, is the only ability card that has been completely reworked due to the major programming that card would have taken to put in. This card now allows another character to select any other card they did not bring, or even select during the leveling up process into the game. So it's a major rework for that card, but every other ability card in the game is working as intended, as written on the cards and as designed. So gameplay or scenario based changes that might happen to you in the dungeon. There's been some balance changes. So some small scenario changes for balance reasons or for the mechanical implementation reasons. Perhaps they weren't practical to actually implement in the game engine exactly how they are worded in the book. It's going to be too long for me to go into every single mission here, but just so you know, in spirit, most of the missions are generally unchanged, or they are in the spirit of what the original mission is intended. They are not drastic deviations from the missions in the book. Returning players may notice a few small differences if they have a very good memory for the very small details in these missions. But if you're a new player, you absolutely will not be able to tell the difference. And even if you're an experienced player, it's unlikely that you will see the differences too if you haven't played the game many times. There is no map overview in the pre-mission screen. So as you select battle goals before you go in and you select your cards, there is no map overview currently at time of recording for you to be able to see how long the dungeon is, how many tiles the dungeon is. You do get to see what enemies are present in the dungeon. However, you don't get to see this bit of information, which can sometimes be a little bit crucial, because if it's a very short scenario, you might consider, okay, I don't need to maybe take as many movement cards. If it's a very long one, maybe you want to take more. And you only actually find this out when you first jump into the scenario. So as soon as you're in, and at that point, you can't change your cards. I have been in discussion with the devs a little bit about this, and we have spoken about it, and they are sort of receptive to this idea of maybe adding something to the pre-mission screen. So watch this space. It might happen. The devs have been very receptive in the past. So it's not to say that it won't happen, but at time of recording and as the game is going live this week, it's not in the game. So just so that you're aware. Also to do with scenario setup, we are playing with hidden rooms and some scenario information that might be a little bit obscure. So some tabletop players may already play with hidden rooms, which is not being able to see the positioning of enemies or the positioning of treasure tiles, all of those things, traps, everything like that in the future rooms. And you may already be doing this by using a companion app, but this is a detraction from the original game, but it will actually be the normal thing in Frosthaven. This is another one of those things where perhaps it wasn't exactly Isaac's intention to have open information. Perhaps it was. Some players get used to it, some players don't. It's one of those things where if you get used to playing with it, then when it gets taken away, you notice it. But if you've never played with it before, you probably won't notice it. Digital also does not signpost certain pieces of scenario information which players would normally be aware of if you are having to manage the scenario yourself. This could be certain boss mechanics. This could be certain trigger points or actions that would trigger things in a scenario. Objective markers. Digital only reveals information when relevant, and similar to the events point earlier, if you have to actually administrate the doing of something, you can plan or strategize around them. You have a bit more awareness of them. So without this information, it's much harder to plan in certain scenarios, which may mean you'll have to play it a couple of times to learn the mechanics before jumping back in and knowing, okay, after I do this, then this particular boss is going to go here, or is going to go do this, or this is the ordering of certain things. This does take a little bit of the strategic edge of the game off, with the hidden rooms and this scenario information not always being present, and it will shift it to a little bit more of a moment-to-moment tactical game at times. So some people are going to like this change, but others may not like this change, especially if they like to plan an entire scenario out from the beginning. But unless you are coming from tabletop and have a predisposition to this, I don't think it's too much of an issue for brand new players. Enemy bosses and friendly allies, they now have their own attack modifier decks and do not share the general monster deck. This will weaken some cursing strategies and make some bosses that attack a little bit more scarier. But for allies, this also means that blessing allies won't come back to bite you, because before you were putting those blesses into the monster deck. So having to share this attack modifier deck was more of a printing and component constraint, and this change was again run by Isaac and approved by Isaac as a change that just makes complete sense. Enemy ability decks. So enemies of the same class but different types, for example an Inox Archer versus a Bandit Archer, will actually draw separate ability cards, whereas in the tabletop version they would share the Archer deck. This only really matters when both of those enemy types are in the same mission. The decks are still exactly the same in terms of the abilities that are inside them. Also, you're unable to see the drawn ability cards, perhaps to try and plan for a certain specific enemy ability coming up. Again, this is like a minor change, but it's a noticeable change if you really like to get stuck into the turn-to-turn strategy of the game. If you know that that summon action is coming up potentially from a cultist because you have a little look through the discarded cards, then you have a little bit more of awareness of that. You still can keep track of this information in your brain, of course. So if you're good at tracking that kind of information yourself, then it's not too much of an issue, but you just don't have that kind of physical crutch, if you like, of being able to go through the discards. This is just another case of, because you're not having to manage the administration in the game, it maybe makes you slightly less aware of things. So curses and bless limits, whereas there's still a hard limit of 10 of each of them inside the scenario, if a scenario effect would require more than 10 to be added, so in a 4-player party, if everybody had to receive 3, that would exceed the number 10, which would have been a physical supply issue, they will actually go above that number 10. However, they will return to normal limits inside the scenario though, so they will kind of go away and you'll be still at a maximum 10 at that point, so you won't be able to add any more. Standee limits, so the number of monsters of each type, these will remain the same as the board game for balance reasons in the campaign, so they are exactly the same as they are in the physical game, but in Guildmaster there is actually a limit of 16 of each monster regardless of the monster type. Ambiguity is slightly different here. When we talk about ambiguity, we're talking about a decision that the players will have to make because there's a 50-50 chance of something happening. They could go this way, they could go that way. There are 2 legitimate choices, and the players would usually make that choice in the physical game. So it's kind of a tiebreaker, essentially. So any kind of ambiguity that players would typically get to decide on the outcome in physical is actually now completely random. So this includes enemies consuming or infusing any element. They will just do that randomly if there's more than one element available for them to consume, or if there's any element that they could create. Movement ambiguities for both enemies and player summons, that will just be done randomly. Players do not get to choose which hex they move to. Enemy push and pull abilities will all be done randomly, again by normal rules. So if there is a choice of where they could be pulled or pushed to, it will be random. Mercenaries tied on initiative, even after the second card, will also be done randomly, whereas usually the players would choose. NPC healing tied targets, so they will prioritize poisoned and or wound first, but then it's going to be random. So whenever there would be a player choice, a player can choose something, then essentially it's now become random for the most part. Area of effect, or the pattern style attacks, AoE attacks are now resolved simultaneously against all targets in the AoE, and the order of the modifiers is completely random. You don't get to choose which modifier you flip against which enemy. No using items in between targets either. They must be chosen and used before the full attack. This is also true of rolling modifiers such as add target and refresh item, which will trigger upon confirming the attack action if they are going to be in the cards that are drawn as part of that attack. You can also rotate AoE patterns as normal, but you cannot mirror them like you could do in the board game. Some changes to resting, so short rests can now be taken at the beginning of a round rather than at the end of your turn. This is something that I think the devs have put in more to the point that people would keep either forgetting to short rest. I think it's a very common mistake in the board game, in the physical game, to say, "Ooh, I meant to short rest," and you didn't. And so players will sort of retroactively try and do that. And without a big undo button in the game, it's very difficult to do that. So it's more of just a fail-safe for players like that, but actually tactically it opens up your options a little bit more too. You can see what happens for the entire previous round before then making the decision, hey, I want to short rest now actually, and get those cards back. When long resting, you can only use items before your long rest action, not afterwards as well. This is a minor gameplay implication for maybe using exhausted items. Maybe you want to long rest, then you want to immediately exhaust an item. It's a very, very corner case thing. Shouldn't have any major gameplay implications. And finally, monster AI. So enemy focus is actually determined by ability and it's not actually locked in by action. The easiest way to explain this is that during a push action, so say if the enemy was to push everybody away and then attack, it could actually focus different targets with the push and then with the attack, because it changes that focus halfway through. So it could have been one focus because they were adjacent, they get pushed away, and then the focus will actually maybe change to a different mercenary with a lower initiative. This is actually the only notable change to the way that monster AI behaves, and it should be working as intended as per the 2nd edition with the FAQ board game rules. So there you have it, guys. There are the changes. What do you think of the changes? Let me know in the comments down below. Some of these I'm a big fan of. Some of them I think are just necessary because it's very hard to port a game to a digital environment. I think they've done a very, very good job. And the devs are still very responsive to our feedback. So any comments that you put down, I'm sure that they will probably end up being read by the devs. And I'm sure they've still got some ideas, some quality of lifestyle changes that they are working on. Just because the game is coming out doesn't mean that they're going to stop development on it. They've been very, very good like that. So yeah, put all of your ideas down in the comments below. What do you guys think about these changes? And of course, it wouldn't be an outro without me asking you to hit the like button and subscribe, or come follow me over at Twitch at twitch.tv/ManageryQuest. As a reminder, I'm going to be streaming a lot this week. I will be posting up on the YouTube community tab the times that I will be streaming, but I'm going to be streaming a hell of a lot over the next sort of week or so as the game comes out. So come hang out, come check out the game for yourself, and let me know what you think live over there. Okay, all that's left for me to say then is thank you all so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one. Bye.
I think still, yeah.
That's the blessing from Jab. That's the blessing from.
Isaac, at this point, can we get your approval to add an additional attack modifier deck for allies in the digital version?